One thing about living in Santa Carla I never could stomach. All the damn vampires.
I'm Zack Bennett. I was born in 1981, but somehow I missed out on seeing the greatest movies of the 1980s. So I'm fixing that. I'm gonna watch these great films and talk about them with my friends who have loved them for decades. This is Video Oblivious.
Episode 9, 1987's The Lost Boys. All right, here we are talking about The Lost Boys, vampire flick that has a killer cast, no pun intended. I want to welcome back Michael Yeager to the microphone. Michael, it would help if I turn your microphone on.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
There we go. Now you can
Now
talk.
I'm actually here.
I almost forgot to do that, which would have been disastrous in the world of podcasting here. So I had another guest that was lined up to be on this episode, and she was really excited about it, but she had some personal stuff come up and couldn't come in. So I put out a call. Hey, who wants to talk about Lost Boys with me? And you answered the call pretty quick. And you were just here a couple of weeks ago for Beverly Hills Cop, but I'm glad to have you back.
Hey, I know. I'm glad to be back. Yeah, I was just sitting around the house, like I told you earlier before we started recording. You know, as a charter pilot, you're sitting around waiting for the call to go to work, and I happened to be on Facebook, I think is where I saw it, and I answered this call instead. Well, I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to be back.
I'm glad you're here. We don't have to go into our history or all that again. We'll just dive right into the movie. How about that?
Fantastic. Yeah, let's do it.
Lost Boys was released July 31st, 1987 by Warner Brothers, directed by Joel Schumacher, and we'll get into the cast here in a minute. The movie was not an overwhelming success at the box office. It was budgeted for $8.5 million. It made that back in its first week, but it only took in $32.5 million overall, and almost all of that was domestic. The movie was in no way a hit internationally. Maybe in Canada is where all the international money came from. Overseas, it did not do anything. Only $200,000 or a little less than $200,000 made in international money. The rest of it was all domestic. It debuted a distant number 2 behind a movie called The Living Daylights, a James Bond movie starring Timothy Dalton that I have never heard of.
Not even the best James Bond. I mean, how does that one go number 2 to the less than stellar James Bond? And I'll probably get a lot of crap for saying that, but he is not my favorite Bond. Of course, I'm not a big Bond fan at all. I've never been a big spy, espionage kind of guy.
Yeah.
But of all the Bonds, Tim Dalton, no.
I've never seen any Bond movie.
You've never seen any Bond
Not
movie.
a one of them.
So I suffered through, and I'll probably get a lot of crap for saying this, I suffered through all of the new ones with, Daniel Craig, right? I suffered through all the new ones.
I almost said Daniel Radcliffe, but that's Harry Potter.
Yeah. So I suffered through all of those, Quantum of Solace and Casino Royale, and it just solidified the fact that I am not a Bond fan, nor am I a Mission Impossible fan. My wife and I brought this up the last time we were talking. As my wife and I will pick sequels or spans of sequels to watch, especially during the summer when there's nothing on TV.
Right.
And Mission Impossible routinely comes up. Everybody says Mission Impossible 3, 4, 5, 6 on to infinity are the best ones, and I cannot draw myself to watch it. And I like Tom Cruise. Yeah. I just don't like spy espionage movies. Don't know what it is.
Well, apparently a lot of people did that week, and they didn't want to see a vampire movie because, it debuted $5.2 million. I said it made back its budget in 1 week. It was actually 2 weeks.
Yeah, and the funny thing about this movie, you said it had a budget of $8.5 million. The original budget for this movie was actually a lot higher. It was actually about a $23 million budget, and Warner Brothers, and we'll get into kind of Schumacher and how he got to become the director of this a little bit too. But when they looked at the cast of this movie and they saw Corey Feldman, Corey Haim, Kiefer Sutherland, these weren't very well-known actors. Jason Patric, they weren't well-known actors at the time.
They were all very
young actors at the time, and they thought, you're casting no-name actors in this movie. Let's revisit the budget, and then they slashed the budget to $8.5 million, from $23 million to $8.5 million.
Well, it worked out well. Those cost savings resulted in a bigger profit.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Because it would not have been if they had spent $23 million. I don't know if it would have gotten.
Well, there are reels of this movie that were left on the cutting room floor, which This movie took 21 days to film. It was started filming on June 2nd, 1986, ended on June 23rd, 86.
Wow,
So
3
21
weeks.
days of filming. Most of the principal filming done in Santa Cruz, California, some of it done on the Warner Brothers studio lot. But a 21-day film, and then they had reels of this movie that were left on the cutting room floor. Like there's an entire reel of this film that is just character development.
Oh, wow.
Nothing but character development seems on how David and the other Lost Boys became who they were, how Max, the main villain of the movie, became who he was, and cut scenes for the end of the movie as well that were supposed to happen post credits. It's pretty insane, some of the stuff that got left out of this movie.
I was delighted when I saw it was only like an hour and 41 minutes or something. I was thinking,
Very short watch.
for a vampire movie especially, you would think those movies tend to be a little more epic, a little longer. But we'll get into the story of the film in a minute, and we'll start to explain why it was so short. But you've got a note on here. We talked about Schumacher becoming the director. Now, he also directed St. Elmo's Fire. He directed The Client, The Wiz, a couple of the Batman movies, and then 8mm, which I thought was a really fun film.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Not too long ago, probably, 10, 12 years ago now.
Yeah, about a decade.
But you said he was not originally slated to film it.
No,
or to
Richard
direct it.
Richard Donner was originally attached to the movie, and the movie was a completely different movie, and we can get in that when we talk about kind of like the outline of the movie. But this was a completely different movie. The original writing, the original screenplay of this movie, and as you can tell kind of from the title, The Lost Boys, it's a very Peter Pan-centric reference, which in the 80s, a lot of things had Peter Pan kind of centric references around them. And so it was a completely different movie at the time. And, as things go into like development hell and they get strung out in the studios, like, I don't know if we want to put money into this. I don't know if this is going to be the right call. Who's the cast? Who's going to direct? Donner eventually just kind of got, fed up as directors do. And he stepped away to direct Lethal Weapon.
Which worked out pretty well for him.
Worked out very well for him.
And we talked at length about that movie earlier in the podcast on an earlier episode. And going to get back in a few weeks, hopefully, to the sequel, Lethal Weapon 2. Looking forward to that.
That's a good one. 2 is great.
So we talked about it didn't do super well at the theater. It didn't last long either. It was only released for 7 weeks, and then it was gone from theaters. Now, today, all of the Cineplexes have 12, 14 screens. There's one here in Nashville that has 27.
Yeah.
Back in the late 80s, they maxed out at, 6, probably 8. I remember there was one here in Nashville that opened in 1987. It's not there anymore, but it was 14 screens, and we were just like, oh, my gosh. And what in the world? Are there 14 movies you can watch that are out at a given time? So movies didn't typically last as long in the theaters because they were shuffling them in and out. They didn't have as many screens available. So it was only in theaters for 7 weeks, but it had a very precipitous fall after the second or third week. I mean, it was way down the list.
Well, in the 80s too, especially when you've got a film that when you can film a movie in 21 days and put it together. I guess this movie debuted about a year later, July 31st, 87. I think you said that earlier. You can obviously spit out a lot more movies, I guess, when there's not as much special effects like there are now. Like, things are so overdone with CGI, and they can shoot a movie 2 years ago, and it takes them 2 years to do the post-production on it to add in all the special effects. So I guess, back then, you could have just shot movies out, but they could only have a short run in the theaters. And then when they had the short run in the theaters, we have to wait a year and a half to go pick it up at Blockbuster or Family Video or, wherever we picked movies up back then.
Well, let's talk about the special effects in this film before we get into the cast. They're not great. They're really not great. And I understand
on an $8 million budget, are you going to have great special effects?
Well, maybe. But the flight of the vampires, just the moving camera, the swoosh on the crane shot is all we get. We don't actually see anyone in flight or any transformations until the last reel of the film. And then they go overboard with it feels like.
Absolutely.
And maybe it was just because, I don't know, they wanted to save that for the end of the movie.
Yeah, I think it was the buildup. I think that's this is done in cinema a lot, is leave the suspense, right? So if you think of movies that have done that, think of Jaws. Jaws would have been a completely different movie had you seen the shark in the first 5 minutes of the movie, right? And you didn't. You saw a little dorsal fin, and that was it. But not until really the big scenes towards the end of it that you see the big, behemoth of a shark come at you. So I think that's kind of the same thought process we're going to in a Schumacher type film is, build up the suspense. Don't really play into that. And I think it worked out a little bit. It probably saved them a lot of money, for probably the big scenes towards the end, which we'll get into because there's some pretty awesome death scenes towards the end of the movie.
There are. But we know it's a vampire movie pretty early. I mean, the kids are coming into town with their mom, and then we see it's the murder capital of the world. Somebody's sprayed graffiti on the back of the billboard, and then Sam, who is Corey Haim's character, he goes into the comic book store, and the guys there pretty much tell him
the Frog Brothers.
There's a lot of vampires. So we'll get into the plot in just a minute. Let's hit the critics. 77% on Rotten Tomatoes out of 77 reviews. It's pretty good.
That's a respectable score.
It's very good. 85% Rotten Tomato audience score. So people tend to really like this movie. Siskel and Ebert did not care for it. It got 2 thumbs down.
This is not their type of movie.
It wasn't. They both agreed on they hated the rehashed premise. But they loved the performances of the actors. They if you watch the video, and it's archived on YouTube, their review of this film from their show, they loved Kiefer Sutherland and Jason Patric especially. They thought those guys were great in the roles. They said they loved the special effects. So if they liked it in the 80s, I guess that's good enough for me. But they just said it was just kind of hokey, and it was a rehashed vampire movie that didn't do anything new for the genre from the 1950s. I will disagree with that. Because what I saw in this film was a melding of 2 genres. We had the teenage movie that was so prevalent in the 80s mixed with a vampire movie, and you got a fun little cocktail out of it. Would you say so?
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is comedy meets horror.
Yeah.
And probably, there were some pretty campy movies that came out in the 80s, where you watch them now and you're like, oh, that's funny. That's comedy. But it wasn't meant to be comedy. This was probably one of the earlier movies where comedy met horror.
Yeah.
Where they put the 2 of them together and it actually worked out.
It really did.
For the better.
The stuff with Corey Haim and Corey Feldman, it really felt like more of a John Hughes type of movie. It was that kind of humor, and then you had the horror side of it with the vampires, and it went back and forth practically seamlessly until the 2 started to mix there toward the end of the second reel, I would say.
Yeah, no, I'll admit there's a few scenes throughout when I think about like Haim and Feldman movies, of the 80s, and you try to go back to that with the nostalgia. There's some scenes in there where you're like, I think that was supposed to be funny, or I think that was supposed to, now looking at it, right? I think that was supposed to be funny. I think that was supposed to be, I don't know. I just, there were some scenes in there that I watched it again the other day and I was like, okay, that fell a little flat. But probably in the 80s me, or maybe early 90s me, probably when the first time I saw this movie, probably laughed at it a lot harder.
Well, let's talk about the first time you saw it. And we were talking a little bit off air. I don't like to talk off air about the movie. I want to save it all. But we got into a little conversation.
That's the magic of the podcast.
It is. But we got into a short conversation before we started recording about this movie and how when you think about 80s movies, it's never at the top of the list of classic 80s movies. It's really, I think, falls into the cult classic category.
Definitely feel like it falls more cult classic, and this film has had kind of a resurgence or a renaissance, so to speak. Like when you said, when it came out, it debuted at number 2, was in theaters for 7 weeks or so, and it I think if I looked at it, it was like number 35 as far as the top producing movies of 1987. Fell way behind like a lot of other movies.
Profitable, but not a major
profitable,
hit.
But not a blockbuster.
Right.
Like this wasn't like Beverly Hills Cop 2, which came out in 1987 and was the number 1 movie. And then Lethal Weapon. Like those 2 movies came out. Those you'd think of those are blockbuster. This, you kind of look back at it and you go, okay, it was a good movie, It was fun. We had fun watching it, and then it kind of went away. But then, through cable networks, it had its resurgence. TNT, TBS played this movie nonstop. The first time I remember seeing this movie is we had a free preview weekend for Stars. This is when we first got cable. This is back in the early 90s. And Stars, when it first came out, I don't know if you remember this, they only played 4 movies.
No, I didn't.
They would play the same 4 movies on a loop over and over and over again, and that's what you would get for the week. And then the next week, they'd have 4 new movies. Oh. And this movie played on a loop for about a good solid week. And I watched it probably 5 times the first time it came out, or when it came out on Stars. And so that's how I got to know this movie. And I probably didn't watch it because I wanted to watch it. I probably watched it because I'm going to take advantage of, we got this movie network, and I'm just going to watch the crap out of this thing.
So you were, 10 years old probably when you
Yeah,
saw it?
probably. Not. Let me see. I was born in 83. This was probably, 93, 94, something like that, I think, is probably when we got cable, for the first time. And it was, that's the reason why I watched it. I think my brother probably turned me on to it, too. He's like, hey, Mike, let's watch this movie. And I was not a horror movie fan, especially at 10 years old. That to me was not, To me, this movie when I was 10 was probably a lot scarier than what it is, at multiple rewatches later on. But it's had such a resurgence. It had its resurgence, like I said, in the 90s when it was played ad nauseum on TBS and the networks and Stars. And then you go later on, and it had another resurgence. I remember seeing again in the early 2000s, it had another resurgence. And I think part of that resurgence came from Corey Feldman and Corey Haim and the 2 Coreys and their reality show that they had in the mid to early 2000s, which was an absolute horrible premise for a
We'll talk about that when we get to the cast.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah.
And I would, and I don't know this, I'm just guessing, I would venture to say there was probably another slight resurgence during the vampire craze around Twilight.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing, Schumacher said, he was interviewed, and I couldn't find a date on when this interview happened. I'm assuming it happened years later, probably, when this movie had its other resurgence. But he was asked, why did you interview, or why did you choose to direct this movie, or when it was passed on to you? And he said, vampires are hot. They're the only erotic monster. Frankenstein is not hot. So I said, okay, that. Okay, I get that. I can see that being a thing. Vampires are the only erotic monster.
Only erotic monster.
That's what he said. I took it, quote, word for word off of the interview.
Well, clearly he never saw Bride of Frankenstein, right?
Yeah, true.
Oh, gosh. No, that's an interesting quote. They're the only erotic monster. Well, maybe he's right. I can't think of any other type of monster that would even remotely approach that.
Well, I mean, I read that quote, and then I got to thinking about it. All right, who are the top 5 sexiest vampires out there?
Mm-hmm.
Right, and so I got this list. Right, so Alexander Skarsgård, number 1 from True Blood.
Okay,
so I could see that. We're getting into that new wave sexy vampire. This was the 80s when when this movie came out. This would have been much later, 2000, mid-2000s.
True Blood was around 10 years ago. 2014, I think, is when it ended or peaked.
Yeah. Ian Somerhalder, also from True Blood. Steven Dorff from Blade.
Okay.
When he was in Blade, apparently he was one of the sexiest vampires. No surprise here, right? Robert Pattinson from Twilight.
Yeah, I thought he would have been at the top of the list.
And number 5, rounding out the top 5, Tom Cruise, Interview with a Vampire.
Really?
Is rated as these are the top 5 sexiest vampires.
I kept waiting for you to say Kiefer Sutherland.
Yeah, he didn't make the list.
Yeah.
He didn't. No, he falls way down. In fact, as you go much further down, he's much further down on the list. I mean, we've got Brad Pitt is on this list. He's number 9. Go down some of the other. Carl Urban on here. James Marsters from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, David Boreanaz from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but Kiefer Sutherland does not show. Oh, nope, he's number 20.
Oh, wow.
Number 20.
Well, you do realize that is now in your Google search history, right?
Oh, yeah, it is. Yeah. I tried to turn my cookies off. I'll just have to delete them because I'm sure I'll get all sorts of crazy
if you're going to do a search like that, incognito mode might be your friend.
Hey, I'm not.
Or use DuckDuckGo or something where you're not being tracked.
I'm not embarrassed by my Google search history.
All right. Well, let's just get into the cast since that's what we're talking about, and we'll get to Kiefer in a minute. We're going to start with Jason Patric. He is, I guess, would he be the central character in the film? I would think Corey Haim as Sam.
It's an ensemble cast, I think, right?
Yeah, but Jason Patric, this is an interesting note. His grandfather was Jackie Gleason.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that until I read your notes prepping for this.
Yeah,
I was like, that's interesting.
That's his mother's father was Ralph Cramden himself. Would we say this was his most iconic role? If you're looking back at his career, you've added some to the list. Movies I've never seen, any of those.
We've got to do something about the number of movies you've seen.
Yeah, well, Audrey and I determined on the Footloose episode, the reason I never saw so many of these 80s movies, I just kept watching Back to the Future over and over and had squeezed out the rest of them from
have time.
From my time because I've seen
too busy
Back to the
dissecting
Future
different timelines
400 times.
Yeah, exactly.
So you've got the list of Jason Patric's more iconic roles than this?
Man, I'm telling you, these are like Solar Babies, came out a year before.
I've never even heard of that movie.
A lot of people haven't. It was a post-apocalyptic, I think it was set on another. It's been years since I've seen it and didn't rewatch it. Just kind of rewatched the trailer for it the other day. But it's set in a post-apocalyptic world where water is a scarce natural resource, and there is a magical orb called the Bondi, I believe, I think is what it was called, that they were trying to search for. Now, in all of its glory, they're being chased by a Nazi kind of like regime that are trying to stop them from finding the magic Bondi, but they're being chased on roller skates. So, yeah, put that in your brain. Think about Jason Patric being chased by Nazis on rollerblades, and that's this movie.
Wow.
Was it a great movie? No.
Doesn't sound like it.
But
no.
For the 80s, this was an adventure. It was an it was an action romp right there. It was good. And then there were Sleepers. Sleepers is probably a little bit more well known, but Speed 2 Cruise Control, which I think was the movie that probably ended Jason Patric's career, and now he's having a little bit of a resurgence. He's got a lot of credits on IMDb when you look at him. And he's got some newer stuff that's coming, so maybe he's finally shaken off that Speed 2 Cruise Control movie. But I didn't think that was a bad movie. Like
Keanu Reeves apparently did.
It didn't live up to the original movie, but it was fun.
Well, the first Speed was really, really good.
Oh, yeah.
That's a classic. I never saw the second one, but I would imagine if it wasn't good enough for Keanu Reeves, it's not good enough for me.
Well, Keanu was doing The Matrix about that time, so yeah, he probably had other things going for him. Didn't want to get tied down to doing a sequel, but now there's talk of a Speed 3. Whether that's going to happen or not, but he said if Sandra Bullock was up for doing it, that he would absolutely do it.
Yeah, so I would watch that if they. I guess I would have to watch the second one, or maybe just read about it on Wikipedia summary or something. I don't know that I want to subject myself to an hour and 45 minutes of that movie. Corey Haim, I would say this might have been his most iconic role, right? At least the one that was really his breakout role. He was in Lucas the previous year, but it was The Lost Boys where people really started to take note of this young actor.
Yeah, absolutely. Lucas was a good movie. Did you see Lucas?
I've never heard of Lucas.
You're killing me.
No.
So Lucas was a good movie.
But I see the cast, and I'm like, okay.
It is a good movie. So Cary Green, of the Goonies, right? Charlie Sheen.
I have seen the Goonies.
Okay.
That's why we're not doing the Goonies episode.
Well, we got to do the Goonies just because. And it's funny because
I only saw Goonies during the pandemic at a drive-in. That was the only time I've seen the Goonies. So maybe
that would have been kind of I would have loved to have seen the Goonies at a drive-in.
Yeah, it was cool. So that's why we're not doing it anyway.
Yeah, so Charlie Sheen, Jeremy Piven, Winona Ryder. And this movie, yes, was probably the breakout. I think it's not one of the first things that Corey Haim did, but this was, like you said, this was kind of his breakout role. This was like a coming-of-age movie where the young, kind of introverted, nerdy kid has a crush on the cheerleader, and his best friend, played by Charlie Sheen, then develops an interest in this cheerleader. And wackiness ensues with an 80s movie, but a very young Winona Ryder in it, Jeremy Piven. It was a good cast, and it was a good movie.
So that was pre-Beetlejuice Winona Ryder.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Very young Jeremy Piven, too. Didn't realize he was active in the 80s.
But Jeremy Piven, like, I've noticed this in his movies, watching back, like, Jeremy Piven always looks old in anything he's done. Like, Entourage, I think, is where he finally, like, settled into his age and how he should look. But anything prior to that, like this movie and when he did PCU, like, he was like a 40-year-old college guy in that movie.
Receding hairline.
Yeah, exactly.
Probably, yeah.
He always plays he always looks so much older than the character he plays.
Yeah, I'm always surprised when I see him and stuff because I just think Entourage immediately when I think Jeremy Piven. There's nothing else that comes to mind except maybe the movies he did.
Best Agent in Hollywood.
Around, the movies he did around the time of Entourage as well. He was a lot of bit roles where he basically played that same type of character. He got quite typecast there. But I thought Corey Haim was really great in this movie. I really enjoyed every scene he was in.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think it was good. I think there was, I don't know, I think this being like his second big movie, and this is me looking and kind of taking off like the nostalgic rose-colored lenses of the 80s. Looking back at some of the scenes, I still think he's trying to find himself in this movie and how he acts. There's some things he does and says, and I don't know how much of it was coached from producers or whatever, but some of the laughs that he gives with the that he does, like, where does that come from? Like, who tells you to do that? Who laughs like that? Like, I don't know. There were some things in it that I look back and it was hard for me to go, okay. Yeah, he's a really good actor for a kid at this age.
Well, I just thought his scenes were really fun. I thought the
lines were really well delivered.
Yeah,
in the comedy, like I think he nailed a lot of the comedic lines, but I think it's like some of it is when you're acting, and you know this because you do improv. It's not necessarily when you deliver the line; it's what you do after you deliver the line, and what is the mannerism of how you deliver that line, timing,
right
at the end of it. And I think he's still kind of learning that in this movie. And you see it several times throughout the movie. And you even see it with Feldman and some of the other younger cast members in this too. It's like Schumacher just threw these guys together. He was so in it with this cast. He fought to keep these guys together. And then he just kind of he told them a lot, run with it. This is your character. Run with it. Develop their personality. And Feldman kind of has the little story about it too. So I think that's kind of where that comes a little bit.
Well, let's talk about Feldman while we're on the topic of the two Coreys. He was already a star by the time this movie had come out. People knew who Corey Feldman was. He was in Friday the 13th, the final chapter. He was in Gremlins. He was Goonies, Stand By Me. He was a bankable child star at that point in his career. People knew who he was.
Yeah, definitely becoming a household name at that point. Very young in Friday the 13th, the final chapter. Very young in Gremlins. Doesn't have a whole lot of screen time in Gremlins. I think, he's got maybe 5 to 7 minutes, but a big movie nonetheless. Then Goonies becomes like his real kind of big breakout role, and then Stand By Me comes, and then he's just solidified as like a child star at that point, and a very, like you said, a very bankable child star at that point. It's like put Feldman in a movie, you're gonna have some success.
And when I think of Corey Feldman, you automatically think of Corey Haim because of the success that they had together. I didn't realize that Corey Feldman was already, like we said, bankable before his first movie with Corey Haim, which was The Lost Boys.
Yeah, and they only starred in 7 movies together. Which to me, it's a lot. But to me, when you think about going back that far, you think, man, for them to be that big of stars, and the first movie that they're together in is in 1987. So you think of the entire span of the 80s. Well, when you think of the 80s and you think of child actors in the 80s, you think of Feldman and Haim. But they really kind of came in much later. Feldman a little earlier, but Haim much later in the 80s. And then they were only in 7 movies together the entire time. So the biggest stars of the 80s were only in 7 movies together. License to Drive was one movie that they were together. Dream a Little Dream in 89, an 80s body swap movie that my wife thinks is hilarious because she loves body swap movies. But yeah, they were in 7 movies together. But yeah, you got to admit, like Goonies and Stand By Me, probably as far as Feldman goes, like those are his top in this, right? Are probably his top 3 movies that he probably did.
And then they had the reality show together, and I had forgotten until I Googled it that Corey Haim passed away in 2010. I remember it once I Googled it, but it was one of those that was just like, oh, that sucks, and I just didn't think much about it. But his death, I mean, because of the way he was prescribed with a bunch of drugs from a bunch of different doctors, he would go around and just get all these different prescriptions and eventually overdosed and passed away. There were laws changed in California attributed to his death and the way that he acquired those drugs.
I mean, it's a very common trope amongst, people that feel pain right in their life. And I can't really speak to this and probably shouldn't speak, so boldly about it, but mental health is a huge thing, right?
Right.
And these guys, if you think back at them, this was the first movie that they did together. The first time they met each other, they knew of each other. I think Haim had auditioned for several roles that Feldman got instead of him. So that's kind of how they know each other. But then, later on in life, like they had their problems with addiction and they had their problems with sexual predators, right? And Feldman's been very vocal about this in the last decade about, he's got names and dates of things, that happened to him and Haim as kids. And then, it's a common trope in, the Hollywood world that you go see different doctors and they prescribe drugs and the other doctor doesn't know what the other one's prescribing. And then you have, and you kind of have your, your Michael Jackson overdose type situations.
I think they're also inextricably linked because they have such similar names. They have the same first name.
Corey and Corey.
It's even spelled the same, Corey. And they're just, when you think of one, you always think of the other. And I do remember the reality show they did. I think, was it VH1 or something?
Yeah, I think it was VH1.
Celebrity craze of the late aughts.
Yeah.
And they did, you said 20 episodes of that show. And I think they had a falling out during that show. And
because Feldman
I believe they reconciled before.
Yeah, Feldman was, really trying to make a comeback. Haim wanted to make a comeback, and that was the whole premise, as they were trying to get back and doing movies together or even doing movies independently. And that was kind of the thought of the reality show was following them around. But Feldman was really the one that was trying to get Haim to get his act back together, taking him to rehab, making sure he went, taking care of him. I think he was living with them, or they were living together, at least at the time. And then, and then they had a huge falling out because Haim basically said, quit running my life. You've been trying to run my life ever since we were kids. So.
Yeah, I hate that I forgot that he passed away. I was thinking, what has he done lately? Well, he's been dead for 14 years, so that would explain.
Well, Feldman was fired from this movie, getting back on the subject of the Lost Boys.
Yeah.
He was fired very early on from this movie because he came to set stoned out of his mind. Now, he was
it fits the character.
14 or 15 at the time when this movie was being filmed, and he came so blitzed out of his mind on cocaine that Schumacher said, you're fired.
Yeah,
Get
that makes sense. I wasn't thinking about how young he was, but I was like, it kind of fits the character, though, doesn't it?
And then he comes back the next day. He apologizes to Schumacher, says, look, it won't happen again. I'm sorry. And the entire rest of the movie, he was a golden child. Was very on his best behavior. In fact, there's it
was only 3. It was only 3 more weeks.
Well, yeah, it's only exactly right.
He didn't.
How early on really was that?
Yeah.
But there's Haim had said before he passed away, this was the greatest personal experience of my life, and that him and Feldman basically after the beginning of shooting started, they basically lived in a hotel together in Santa Cruz and stayed together. They never left each other's side. When the other would go to the set, the other would go with them. And they basically watched movies in their room the entire time because they were much younger than the rest of the cast of the movie. Kiefer Sutherland and Jason Patric, they were all in their 20s at this point, much older. And so they were kind of the younger cast members. So they spent a lot of time together just hanging out.
Let's talk about some of the older cast members, though. Let's go to Dianne Weist. We just talked about her on a Footloose episode. We did the last episode I did with Audrey. She plays Lucy, the mom. She had just won an Oscar the previous year for Best Supporting Actress. So this feels like a step back for her in her career to be in this role.
Yeah.
Well, I guess if they shot it in '86, maybe she hadn't won the Oscar yet, but it feels like it's...
But yeah, even then, like, the Oscar buzz was there. Like, I think award shows were much bigger back then. Like, they're big now, but people don't watch them as much as what they probably did in the 80s. So there was probably a lot of Oscar buzz coming around at that point. But she said in an interview, they approached her about doing this movie, and she said, yeah, sounds like fun. Like, that was her signing on to the movie. It's like, yeah, sounds like fun.
We talked about on the Footloose episode how good she was in that movie, and she was very good in this movie.
She's
a natural.
A fantastic actress, and she's got a huge, resume out there. I mean, with just thinking about these two movies, but there's other movies that she's done that she is kind of like, for us growing up in the 80s and the 90s, she was our mom.
Yeah.
Like, she played that mom character very well, and she can play a strong motherly character, or she can play that passive mother character very well. And some of the movies she did, Edward Scissorhands was a fantastic movie. Did you see it?
A long time ago.
Okay, but you did see it.
Yeah,
all right.
I have.
So
it's been a while.
So she did Edward Scissorhands. She did Parenthood with Steve Martin. Was a fantastic movie. I think that came out like 90. And then just recently, within a couple years ago, she did a sitcom called Life in Pieces, which was kind of, I almost think it kind of rode on the heels a little bit of Modern Family, which my wife and I are currently like in season 9 of Modern Family right now, but we watched all of Life in Pieces, and we thought that was a fantastic premise for a TV show, but it, I think, lasted 4 seasons or so, 4 or 5 seasons.
Yeah, she's been in, I mean, you look at some of the other movies she was in. I remember her, I would say more recently. God, it's been 17 years now. But Dan in Real Life, have you ever seen that movie with Steve Carell?
Right?
Oh, it's a fantastic film. She plays, I think, his mother. Does she not?
She does play his mother.
You mentioned Edward. She did Bullets Over Broadway. She did a really bad movie with Chevy Chase called Cops and Robertsons. That one was not great. I do remember that. The Birdcage, Practical Magic. I mean, even into the 90s, she was in really big blockbuster movies.
She played, and this is one of my, this is like a go-to movie for me every single year. It wasn't a very popular movie, but The Big Year. Did you see The Big Year with Jack Black, Owen Wilson, and Steve Martin?
No, I didn't.
So let me set this movie up for you.
But I want, with that cast, I want to see
exactly.
it. Yeah.
But when you hear the premise of the movie, like, I gave you the cast. Now here's the premise of the movie. The premise of the movie is Steve Martin, Owen Wilson, and Jack Black are bird watchers. And The Big Year is a competition held every year by a bird seed company for the bird watcher who can see the most individual species of birds throughout a year.
It's starting to sound familiar.
I haven't
seen it, but I remember it. Yeah.
I don't know what it is about that movie, but I will watch it every year around Christmas time, and I don't know why around Christmas time, because I think there's only maybe one scene in the movie that's Christmas-centric. Doesn't make it a Christmas movie. But it is a comforting movie to me. It is funny. It is well thought out. It has a fantastic cast with just those 3 guys, but then you've also got Jim Parsons in it. You've got from Parks and Rec, she was the nurse. What was her name? Rashida Jones.
Rashida Jones
is in it.
I almost said Ann Perkins, the character name.
Ann Perkins. Oh yeah, up beside Rob Lowe.
Yeah.
But like, it is a good movie. It is a fantastic movie. If you haven't seen it.
And Diane's in that as well.
And she is, she plays Jack Black's mom.
Okay. Always the mom.
Yeah, she is the one who she really encourages throughout that. And I think Brian Dennehy plays his dad. And of course, you can see from like Brian Dennehy characters, he doesn't agree with it.
Yeah.
But it is a fantastic movie. It is a really good movie. But that's one of my favorite movies she's in.
Bernard Hughes is Grandpa. That's his name. Grandpa. He doesn't get a name outside of that. But most of his notable roles came later in life, such as this one. He was an actor who made his way through the acting world forever, and then it wasn't until he was in his 50s that he started getting cast for things, notable movies, I should say.
Yeah, I remember him, from this movie, but then later on he did a movie with Michael J. Fox called Doc Hollywood, where he played like the town doctor. And it's like the iconic line in that, I think, is Doc says to give him a Coke. And there's this scene where this Michael J. Fox's character is, thinking this kid needs to be rushed to the emergency room, and they're calling for like a care flight for this kid to come, and the doctor's played by Barnard Hughes is like, just give him a Coke. And Michael J. Fox, being the Hollywood doctor, you can't give the kid, you can't cure things with Coke and blah blah blah. And like, turns out the kid was just like chewing on his daddy's tobacco, and he just needed to burp. So it was a pretty classic line. But Barnard Hughes in this movie, I think his character is like this old hippie guy. He's probably lived in the Santa Carla, the fictional town of Santa Carla, his entire life. He's this old hippie guy, and he does weird taxidermy.
Yeah,
and he has specific rules to his house that are don't touch the second shelf because that's where his double stuffed Oreos and his soda pop is, and don't you might, what did he say? You might get the urge when the TV guide comes in to tear the address label off it, which is a trope in a lot of shows that talk about TV guide. Like I think Seinfeld referenced it, Friends referenced it, but you don't tear the address label off because it'll rip it, and I don't like that, is what he says. As far as that, but a very kooky, kind of crazy character.
Why do you have TV Guide if you don't have a TV?
You don't. Well, if you got a TV Guide, you read about what you're watching, and you don't need TV. That's what he says, or something like that.
Yeah, that's exactly what he says. Edward Herrmann plays Max, who we find out is the true villain of the movie. I recognized him immediately, and I was like, but I know him from somewhere. Where do I know him from? And I looked it up on IMDb, and he was the dad in Richie Rich, the Macaulay Culkin movie from the early 90s. That's the childhood memories just came flooding back when I saw him on screen.
Yeah, you've got on here, like, he was also in Overboard, which was a year earlier, right? So Goldie Hawn.
And I've seen that
Kurt
one
Russell,
many times. Yeah.
With a terrible remake done, I don't know, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago. There was a terrible remake. And Anna Faris, yeah, did a terrible remake of it. But I think he's probably better recognized, and my wife would recognize him. My daughters would recognize him as Richard Gilmore from the Gilmore Girls. He did like 100 and something episodes on the Gilmore Girls. Yeah, exactly. Like, I know him from it just because when I walk into the room and I see what is it, Alexis Bledel and Lauren Graham on there, I go, okay. Like, there's witty banter, and I think that kind of catches me in certain scenes. Like, it's a very well written show.
Yeah.
And there's very witty banter in it. But after that, I can't get past the premise of it. But I recognize, Edward Herrmann from Richard Gilmore, who also played Herman Munster in a remake of The Munsters.
And he looks like he would be a Herman Munster, doesn't he?
He's a big guy.
He looked like Fred Gwynne a little bit. I could see that. But he was typecast as Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He played him twice in two different features. Well, one was a miniseries about FDR in the 70s called Eleanor and Franklin, and he was played FDR in Annie, the 1982
did
musical.
Did it so
film.
well, we bring him back for a musical.
And he passed away right around 10 years ago, back in 2014. Let's talk about Kiefer Sutherland. When you look at the cover, the poster for this film, of course, Jason Patric is out front, but Kiefer Sutherland's dead center and just staring at you with piercing eyes, right?
Yeah.
Kiefer Sutherland, of course, very good-looking guy, second-generation actor. Everybody knew who his dad was. He maybe have been a little bit of a Nepo baby to get into Hollywood, but he's definitely proven himself, has he not? He has become a bankable actor, more so maybe on television than film, but he's definitely a household name at this point.
Yeah, Jack Bauer.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, like, that's probably, if you didn't know him from anything else, you probably know him from 24.
So let's talk about 24 for a minute.
Okay.
So that show started in the fall of 2001, and if you're going to talk about probably the perfect time for an anti-terrorism show to begin, fall of 2001, unfortunately, was probably the perfect time for that show, and it was a massive hit right out of the gate. I didn't watch it. I was in college at that point. DVR wasn't a thing. I just didn't have time to watch that film or that show. But I do remember it being just a massive, massive hit. A few years later, let's say 2005, is when I moved to Alabama. And by this point, I'm out in the real world, and I have a TiVo, and I can watch stuff whenever I want to. And my boss was a huge fan of that show, and he's like, you got to watch this. You got to watch this show. And I said, well, do I have to go back and watch the previous years? No. Every year stands on its own. You can just watch it. So I don't remember which season it was. It was third or fourth season. So I agree. Okay, I'll start watching the show. So I start watching it, and this was the one, the season where there was the biochemical in Los Angeles, and they had to go to Long Beach because it might have been in the crates somewhere at the Long Beach facility. So his girlfriend, Jack Bauer's girlfriend, in that show, her name is Audrey Raines, right? My wife's maiden name is Audrey Raines, spelled exactly the same way. So I'm watching the show. I'm new to this job down in Alabama. And my now wife, we didn't know each other. She got hired on at the radio station right around the same time I did. And she was the receptionist, and we had a little small talk, but there was nothing between us. Like we were coworkers. We just kind of knew who each other were. And then she gets promoted to another job, and so we start working more closely. And I wasn't thinking about it one day, and I open up my email, and I get an email from Audrey Raines. As I'm like 12 episodes into 24 at this point, I'm like, whoa, what? That's Jack Bauer's girlfriend. Am I getting emails from her? And it was like just a kind of a mind screw. And so that was actually what brought us together. Was I went upstairs. Did you know that your name is the same as the character on 24? And that's really how we met. And now we've been married.
Did she have
for
any
15
idea?
years. She didn't. Well, I think somebody had mentioned it to her, but she wasn't a fan of the show either.
Yeah.
And I think it is implied. It turns out that Audrey is not my wife, but the character is not a terrorist in the show. But for several episodes, she is suspected as being the one behind all of this. And so one of our coworkers nicknamed my wife the terrorist at work, and she finally had to say, you need to stop calling me that, because this was not too long after 9/11.
We work in media, and everybody is on high alert. This is probably not a good idea for you to be saying this.
So anyway.
All right, so Kiefer Sutherland is directly responsible for you and your wife getting together.
Potentially, yeah. So I'm in New York a few years later, and I go to the live broadcast of Live with Kelly and Michael. This is when Strahan was still on, Kelly Ripa, in the morning, and I didn't know who the guest was, and it was Kiefer Sutherland that day. So I've breathed the same air as Kiefer Sutherland, and I was in the studio with him, and that was really cool. And he, I'm just thinking the whole time, I'm like, I stole your girl. I stole your girl, Jack Bauer.
You got one up on Jack Bauer.
There you go. That's my Jack Bauer
The only
story.
person in the, 9-10 seasons and many reiterations of 24 to get one over on Jack Bauer.
And it was me.
Wasn't the premise of that show, I only saw so many episodes of it, wasn't the premise of that show, like each season took place in a 24-hour period,
yes,
right?
It took place in real
time.
time.
What a wild idea for a TV show. Like, how do you pitch that to, like, executives at NBC or CBS? You go, got an idea.
It wound up being Fox.
Was it Fox?
It was Fox,
Well,
yeah.
Fox will take anything, so never mind. I guess I kind of take that back. But, like, the conversation's got to be, we got an idea. It's about terrorism and like an elite anti-terrorism unit, and the seasons take place over a 24-hour period. So 24 episodes, 1 hour each. Each 24.
It was so
really?
cool,
Whoa.
though. It was a cool concept, and it's worth a rewatch. It's a little cheesy now with some of the early aughts tech and stuff, but it was a very novel concept for the time, because real time stories just weren't told in film or television at that point. Of course, all the climactic things happen on the hour, though, right? They happen right at the 59 minute, so you got to wait to see what happens next.
And then they have like a blinking clock too, each.
But you can, and that was the soundtrack to the show, was just this little digital beep 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 beep, and so you would see that as it would go into commercial. You would see the clock, and it always lined up exactly with what minute of the hour was that you were watching it on live TV. It was pretty inventive, so I'll give it that. And it was on for 8 or 9 seasons. I think they made a movie.
Yeah.
But Kiefer Sutherland, probably his most famous role is Jack Bauer.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, prior to that, though, Stand By Me, though, like you.
That's on the list. I haven't seen it.
Yeah. Okay.
We need to do that one.
It is. It's good.
Yeah.
It's a very good coming of age.
I've heard good things.
I don't want to give it away, but a great cast with Feldman, Will Wheaton in it. A very chubby young Jerry O'Connell, who's on a daytime TV show now.
A game show host.
He's a game show host. I think he's on a talk show too. I loved him in Sliders. Sliders was a fantastic TV show in the early 90s done by Fox. And then Feldman in it too, and then Kiefer Sutherland. But there's a tie-in to Stand By Me in this, and there's a very, very, very well thought out fan theory, and I'll let the listeners to our podcast really go out there and look at it. But there is a lot of compelling evidence that Ace from Stand By Me is actually David from The Lost Boys.
Okay. After I see Stand By Me, we will dive into that. Let's talk about Jami Gertz. I was thinking, I don't think I'd seen her in a role where she was so young. Everything I've seen her in has been later in her career. Even starting with Twister and Seinfeld in the mid 90s. She was on an episode of Seinfeld. She was the "Can you spare a square" lady with Elaine. And then she did a sitcom back in the early 2000s. I remember her I can't remember the title of it right now, but she was no, that's not what I thought. I had it on the list, but I don't. But she did a sitcom, and that's what I remember her from. And I was seeing her in this movie, and I even paused the movie, and I said to my wife, I said, man, she was gorgeous when she was in her early 20s.
Wasn't she?
She was just strikingly beautiful in this movie. She was also in Less Than Zero with Robert Downey Jr. that same year. Obviously, I haven't seen that.
Is Still Standing? Is that the
Still Standing?
Still Standing.
That's the name of the show. Yes, thank you for
I had to
looking
look
that
it up.
And was reportedly offered and rejected the role of Rachel Green on Friends that went to Jennifer Aniston.
Wow.
Yeah.
Could you imagine? I mean, it went to the right person.
Yeah.
But could you imagine just what that feels like, turning that role? She turned it down.
That's what you said, right? Yeah.
Could you imagine?
Reportedly.
Turned it down.
Yeah. I don't know where that story came from, but I read that in several places, so I'm just going to assume that it's true. And you said she and Jason Patric had starred in that Solar Babies movie.
Yeah, they were in Solar Babies together, and Jason Patric is the reason why she was cast in The Lost Boys.
Okay.
He went to bat for her. He said, I think she would be perfect. I was in this movie with her. It would have probably been a year and a half or 2 years prior to this, but they were in a movie together, Solar Babies, and he went to bat. He said, like, she's a fantastic actress. I think she would be great for the role. Jami Gertz's character, Star, in this movie was not, like, she was the concept of her character took on a lot of different formations. Originally, Star was supposed to be a guy in an original iteration of the screenplay. And then it was supposed to be a blonde, and then it was back to being a guy again, and then back to being a blonde. And they wanted to cast a blonde for this, and he said no, like, she's perfect for this role. And Jason Patric didn't want to do this movie to begin with. There was a lot of back and forth between him and Richard Donner when he was attached to it, and mainly Joel Schumacher in the studio about doing this movie. He didn't want to do it. He didn't want to get roped into doing a vampire horror movie, because in the 80s, horror movies were still kind of viewed as like second-rate, kind of campy movies. You don't really go anywhere once you do them. You don't become a big star. Now,
or they could turn into a
Babies,
franchise.
You become a big star. Yeah, exactly.
Like horror movies in the 80s, you think Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, and
you're going to get killed and you're never going to come back. Or unless you're the star, and then you're going to come back and then you're going to get killed.
Yeah.
But he went to bat for her, and so she got cast in this movie specifically because of him. Like, he went to bat for her and said she needs to be in this movie.
Well, good for her. It worked out well. Jamison Newlander plays Alan. this clearly is his best known role. I don't even recognize his name, and nor did I recognize anything else on his IMDb. And then Alex Winter, a very small part in this movie. He's actually credited as Alexander Winter. He plays one of the vampires named Marco. And we all know him as Bill S. Preston Esquire from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, which when I looked it up, I was thinking, wasn't that 87? That was 89.
89.
That felt like an 87.
The very end, very tail end of the 80s.
Yeah, and that was about the point so I was 8 years old when that came out. I remember seeing that when it was new. So that one definitely not going to qualify for Video Oblivious. but I did notice he was credited as Alexander Winter. Mm-hmm. And he's on the poster.
Yeah.
He's way back in the background, but he's on the poster as well.
And so Schumacher asked him, and I don't know if maybe he's responsible. I couldn't find evidence to support this, if he's responsible for Alex Winter shortening his name. But I think there was somebody already in the Screen Actors Guild or somebody already credited as Alex Winter at the time. But he had went to him and said, hey, would you mind shortening your name? I don't like the way it looks on the credits. And so I read that, and I said, well, let me go to the credits. So I went to the end credits, and I'm like, I don't see why it looks weird. And then I scrolled to the beginning of the movie because I thought, oh, wait, this is an 80s movie. We have a 5-minute montage of credits at the very beginning of the movie. Does it look weird there? And so I scrolled to the very beginning, and he is credited in there above somebody else, I guess one of the other Lost Boys characters who has a much shorter name. And his very long name is above it or below it. I don't remember looking at it. I'm like, okay, that does look weird. I could see where I thought that's a very director thing. Can you shorten your name because I don't like the way it looks? And he didn't want to do it.
I guess he could have flip-flopped the names, but then you've got Alex Winter credited behind somebody with a smaller role, but it might look better on screen.
Yeah. Well...
And that's a big deal. And it really is. And maybe not for somebody who plays a bit role in a movie or show. But I've heard the story about, and we'll stick with the 80s, about Cheers, when Ted Danson and Shelley Long were co-billed as the top stars of that show. And whenever you see their names on the screen, on the credits, Ted's is to the left and down, and Shelley's is to the right and up. So if you're looking at it from the left, Ted is first. And if you're reading it top down, Shelley is first.
Oh.
And that was the compromise they came to, so they could both be billed
as
the top star of the show. And so that is something that is actually negotiated. And then if a character or if an actor is at the end where it says, and I'm thinking, who's the boss? And Katherine Hellman as Mona or whatever. They negotiate that too, so it stands out that they're last with their character's name. So it is a big deal where somebody falls in the credits.
Yeah, it's funny that that's a negotiation tactic. Nowhere else in the world is that a negotiation tactic. But when you're an actor, I can say, well, we'll put your name before this person so everybody sees it first. And now you go to movies now where there's no 5 to 10 minute montage at the beginning of a movie anymore with credits rolling, and you go, who is that person? Oh, you just go to IMDb and look it up.
Right.
But back then it was a huge thing, to have your name billed before somebody else. So that's a negotiation.
It was a SAG rule that they had to have opening credits, and George Lucas was the first one to break.
He broke
that
it
rule
with Star Wars, right? With A New Hope,
right? And that was a big deal. That there was no director credit at the beginning of Star Wars. There was no actor credits. And George Lucas, being George Lucas, was like, I don't care. It worked out. And then, of course, the rules have been changed now. But it was actually a rule back in the 70s and into the 80s. And I think it was probably the 90s before it really got completely phased out. Because you're right. You watch all these 80s movies, and there are 3 or 4 minutes of a song establishing shots and then all the credits before we get into the
TV
movie.
shows, too, right? Because we had jingles in the 80s, or we had very, very specific theme songs, mostly written by Mike Post and a couple other people who were the king of theme songs.
Right. Alan Thicke.
Yeah.
He wrote a bunch of theme songs.
Exactly. These guys are the king, and they would write these songs, and they would have to be long enough to get all of the people's names in with some sort of getting off a bus and then giving a smile look by the actor or whatever.
I actually know a little bit of stupid media trivia about that, too. So it was in the mid-'90s, in 1994, ABC issued an edict to all of their shows. We're getting away from that. We're just going to go to credits on screen as the show starts. We don't want to see a 30-second theme song anymore. We just want to get right into the show, right? And they issued this edict and said, we're not doing this anymore. That same year, Friends comes out on NBC. And the theme song's so iconic for Friends, the song becomes a massive hit. You still hear that song. It's the first thing you think of. And ABC walked it back, went, well, okay.
Maybe rethink this.
Yeah. And so it took a little while longer, but now you don't see it anymore.
No.
Like, it's completely gone at this point. Yeah. Or you'll see a cold open and then a shorter theme song like Big Bang Theory was only, 7 or 8, well, probably 12 seconds, 15 seconds of their opening theme.
Well, it was so fast.
Right.
I mean, Bare Naked Ladies, they sing fast anyway.
We saw Bare Naked Ladies in concert at Bridgestone Arena a few years back, and they sang the whole song.
Did they really? There's
really
like 3 or 4 verses.
Yeah, there are. Right. And the crowd was going nuts, and he's like, well, that's what we're known for these days, so that was really fun.
Not the 1 week song from American Pie.
Right.
They're known for the theme song to The Big Bang Theory.
Yep. A quick recap. Well, we've gotten an hour into this, and we're just now getting to the plot of the film. It's a divorced mom and 2 teenage sons. They move from Phoenix to the fictional Santa Carla, not Santa Clara, Santa Carla, to live with her father after a divorce, right? The boys separately discover that the town is a haven for vampires. The older, Michael, Jason Patric, he gets involved with the vampires while chasing Star, who is affiliated with them. The younger, Sam, he meets a couple of young vampire hunters, and I mean very young vampire hunters, the Frog Brothers. Michael begins to become a vampire after he drinks a bottle of blood, and apparently in this world, your fate as a vampire is not sealed until you consume a victim, at which point you become full vampire. You're only a provisional vampire until that point.
You're a vampire apprentice.
And there is a chance to go back. So meanwhile, Sam and the hunters, they realize that the hunters say, if you kill the head vampire, it rids everybody of the threat. And the half vampires, the provisionals, they return to be fully human again at this point, right?
Yeah.
And then the other vampires all die. So that's the premise of the film. You've got half of it. I guess the horror side is the story of the vampires and Michael becoming a vampire and Star. And then the comedy side are the vampire hunters with the younger kids trying to seek out the head vampire. And the funniest scene to me, laugh out loud, is the dinner scene with Max at the house where they're trying all the vampire tropes to get him to kill him while he's there dating the mom.
And this is the first time I remember, like, you remember the vampire tropes, right? Like the 3 rules to killing a vampire, right? It's a stake to the heart, holy water, or garlic, right? Like, or daylight. So I guess there's 4. Apparently, this movie decided to play fast and loose with tradition on what vampires could actually do it. And it spawned a lot of different things later on that we begin to see. So this was groundbreaking for vampire, lore. Like before then, it was like the only way to kill it was stake through the heart, get him in some sunlight, get some holy water or whatever, and he's dead. This movie decides to take it, a little bit different in how you became a vampire, right? When I was a kid at this age, growing up, there were things in life in the 80s and the 90s that we thought were going to be a lot worse problems for us,
Sinkholes.
Yeah, exactly. Quicksand would being one of them. I always thought
stop, drop, and roll.
Stop, drop, and roll, right? Just say no to drugs. And if you get bit by a vampire, you're doomed because there's no way to come back from that. And it was just a bite from a vampire, right? There was none of this. You had to drink the vampire's blood like in Interview with a Vampire, right? They bit you, but then you had to drink the vampire's blood in order to become a vampire. Mm-hmm. And then you go later on to much later on, and you have like the Twilight ways of doing it, and this was like the first movie where they broke that cardinal rule of you don't have to be bit to be a vampire.
You just have to
drink their blood.
Yeah, just drink their blood
out of a really disgusting looking
ornate
wine bottle.
Yeah. And you've got a note on here. The original script was much different, and we talked about that, but it spawned a different movie released later that year.
Yeah, absolutely. So the original script for this movie, and the writers for this movie, like, had a couple of different treatments to it. But like I said earlier, there was a huge theme in the 80s about Peter Pan. Mm-hmm. Peter Pan was like a very well-known theme, J.M. Barrie's books and stuff like that. So
was it probably entering public domain around that time?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Because
Disney did the cartoon.
Yeah. So this was the thought process in the original script was Peter Pan is a vampire. His lost boys are young, vampires that he turned, and that's why they never age. And the vampire hunters were supposed to be I think the way it's specifically said is chubby Cub Scouts are the vampire hunters.
Okay. So
they didn't like the way that went when Schumacher got a hold of the script, and he said, "No, we need to, this is the 80s, and I don't want to do a kids movie." Donner really didn't want to do a kids movie, so they kind of did different treatments. And Donner was still an executive producer on the movie. So
yeah, I noticed his name in the credits.
They said, let's age this up a little bit. Let's make the vampires in their 20s, and we'll make the vampire hunters in their teens. And so they aged everybody up a little bit. But originally it was supposed to be like a Peter Pan slash kind of horror type movie where Peter Pan, it's a play on J.M. Barrie where he's the vampire.
Yeah.
And the reason why these are the lost boys is because they get bit and they never age. So that was kind of the original. So that original script, kind of a lot of the writing got put on the cutting room floor, so to speak, and a movie came out a year later. And so they wanted this movie to be kind of like The Goonies because it was a Donner movie and he did so well with that movie. They said, we want it to be like a Goonies horror movie. And so they didn't like that, and they aged everybody up. And then later that year goes into production a movie called The Monster Squad, which the writers from that movie then turned around and said, well, we liked a lot of these things that we saw from it because the script had been passed around. Everybody had seen it. They said, we like a lot of things, so let's do, based off of that, a Goonies-type movie and not just necessarily have a vampire in the movie. We'll add all of the classic movies in there, like The Swamp Thing and The Wolf Man and a mummy and a vampire in there, and which I think spawned probably one of the coolest lines is kick him in the nards, Wolfman ain't got no nards. That is probably the best 80s line I remember, and I loved The Monster Squad. It's a fantastic movie.
Well, let's talk about The Monster Squad, because I just looked it up on Wikipedia. I'd never heard of it until just now. It was released 2 weeks to the day after The Lost Boys.
There you go.
August 14th, 1987. It's a short little flick at 82 minutes of running time.
Yeah.
And it was a massive box office flop with a budget of $14 million. So a budget of almost double The Lost Boys.
Right.
And it only brought in $3.8 million.
What it had going for it, the reason why it got more money is because that's how it was pitched. It was pitched as The Goonies, but with monsters.
All right. Well,
and this
that's
movie
the reason I don't remember it.
This movie saw a lot of resurgence when Hulu became, when it first kind of came out to the streaming platform. This was one of the movies that was a major rotating tile on there when we got Hulu as soon as it came to market, and this was a rotating tile on there. And I thought, I remember that movie. This is an awesome movie from when I was a kid. I gotta watch this movie again. And I made my wife watch it and my kids watch it, and now it is like a yearly watch for us because it is just a funny, fun movie.
I'm looking at the cast, and I only recognize two names on the entire cast. I recognized Mary Ellen Trainor just because we had just done Lethal Weapon, and she's in that, and she's got a small part.
It's
and Jason Hervey from the Wonder Years is the only other person on there.
And
that
he's got
recognize.
a small role in it too. He's like the town bully or something like that.
Well, his mother was a casting agent in Hollywood, and that's how he got cast as a child actor so often. Was that he really was a Nepo baby.
Yeah.
He was getting that from his mom.
But if you look at stills from this movie, since you're on IMDb, tell me that when you see the group of the kids together, that it's not almost a direct ripoff of some of the characters from the Goonies. You've got the main character, and then you've got a kid that's got glasses on, so he's supposed to be the mouth character, and then you've got a fat kid, that's supposed to be the, what's his name? Oh God, now I feel horrible for.
There's a Chunk.
Chunk.
Yeah,
sorry.
There's a lot of scenes. I'm looking at the photos from Monster Squad. There's a lot of scenes in the dark and in the woods, and it does very much resemble Goonies.
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh man, if Video Oblivious Halloween edition, we got to do this one.
All right, well,
we got to do this one.
That's several months away, but we'll look into that. Let's just get in. I loved Lost Boys. I really did love it. I thought it was a quick watch. It wasn't too long. It was right at the right length. It captivated me from start to finish. Like I said, I loved the scenes with Corey Haim. I know maybe not as much you did, but I thought those scenes were great. I thought the special effects, like we mentioned, were a little cheesy, but it was the 80s. It felt cheap until the last reel, though. And Siskel and Ebert's biggest criticism of it was it felt like a very imbalanced movie because it was a lot of comedy horror for the first 2/3 of it. And then when it gets to that last 20, 30 minutes, it becomes a straight-up horror movie.
Yeah.
But you're right. There are a lot of cool kill scenes in this movie. There really are. But you finally see the special effects come into play more, and it was right around the time I commented out loud to Audrey. I was like, the special effects kind of suck. Oh, hey, they're flying now. We can actually see it. So that part, I enjoyed it from start to finish.
Yeah.
And I was thinking the Max thing didn't surprise me when he turns out to be the head vampire, because when they did the scene where they feed him the garlic and they're throwing water on him and everything, I'm thinking, well, this is a massive red herring. He's clearly only in this movie for a reason, and it's not to be mom's love interest,
exactly.
right? So it's storytelling wise, it didn't fool me when he turns out to be the big bad at the end. But I really did enjoy it from start to finish.
Yeah, no, I mean, I love this movie. I think watching it, over and over again, because we watch this movie every year. In fact, I watched it again the other day just to kind of prepare, but we watched it in October. So we do, basically from the end of September through October, in my house, it becomes horror movies, which like I said, I am not a huge horror movie fan. My wife is. She loves horror movies. She loves exorcism type movies, anything that kind of has cult along with it or has some sort of religious type of theme to it. That's her movie. And so, there's only so many of those movies. So then you start to go back to the classics and stuff like that. And so my youngest, Kennedy, we let her watch it. She's 14, so we let her watch it for the first time, I think. And of course, she fell in love with Jason Patric. She thinks he is he hung the moon. And I'm like, go back and watch Solar Babies or Speed 2 Cruise Control, and you will fall in love with this man. But yeah, I mean, it's a fun movie, like you said. The comedy aspect of it. There's some scenes I could have probably. The bathroom scene where Corey Feldman's in a tub, singing 50s music and stuff like that. Go take a bath. It's summer vacation. Is he really going to be taking a bath? Is your brother really going to tell you to do that? Does this scene really fit? And it's really just there to build up Michael turning into a vampire. Things I did really love about it now, watching it, as a cinephile and somebody who really looks at movies. And I love reading about what movies were supposed to be and then how they shot them. the thing at the very beginning of the movie where they're panning in and they kind of introduce all the vampires. And of course, vampires are apparently always really well sexily dressed for the 80s, which it's summer in Santa Carla, California. But apparently it's okay to wear a lot of leather and trench coats because it's really hot outside. But that's okay. But the scene where they're on the merry-go-round coming through, I love the thought, like you see all the vampires come through, like you see David, and then you see the next couple of characters, and the last one is Marco. They appear in that order, and they are all killed in the opposite order of the way they appear in the movie.
Oh, really?
So I thought that was kind of like a really like fun little nod to it. The special effects, like you said, they don't get any better until like the last kill scene. So there's the scene where they all go to the vampire lair that's in a abandoned hotel that is sunken into the San Andreas Fault in the early 1900s, and we're setting up the scene. And you got Corey Feldman and the Frog Brothers characters. You got Corey Haim there, and they're all there to kill the vampire. And the first one they come up to is Marco. Bill S. Preston Esquire, and he's going to be the first one they kill, and they get up to him, and I mean, they like jab the stake, and I mean, it's just this massive like blood pool that comes flying out of him. I'm thinking to myself, you don't really see that in movies. Like usually when a vampire dies, they catch on fire, like they spontaneously combust or they turn to dust. Like they don't just like explode from their chest and bleed out.
Yeah. And
then I thought to myself, well, wait a minute. Like, didn't they say something like, Edgar Frog is like the encyclopedia of vampires with the comic books and everything he does. And he says in that movie that kind of opens the door for all this is no vampire ever dies the same way. So that's how like every single one of them die a different way, right? He explodes.
Cool.
And then, then you have the one that is in the garlic bathtub, which she said, garlic doesn't work. Well, there's a trope that's busted out for years. As a kid, I'm thinking to myself, what are they going to do? Garlic is like the primary thing to kill vampires. Like in Monster Squad, I think they put pizza on Dracula's face that has garlic on it.
Well,
and
now
it
you
burns
spoiled
him.
it.
Well, it's a 30-year-old movie. So I think the statute of limitations are out on that.
Okay.
But, spoiler alert. But
I mean, you spoiled it for me if we're going to do the movie
and everybody else. But there is that scene in there, right? So, then they push him in a thing of like holy water. Who blessed that bathtub? Like, that's a lot of water, and who blessed it, And the thing I wanted.
They sneak into the church during the baptism and steal the holy water.
So they diluted the bath water, though. Or did they really get like 150 gallons of holy water and then like pour it all in there? Thermos pour it in there. And then the other one gets killed by the stereo, right? He hits him with a bow and arrow, and he misses him because he goes flying through this guy, and then he shoots him in his stereo, and he gets electrocuted. And I guess that qualifies as a wooden stake through the heart with an arrow that's got a metal tip on it.
Sure.
I guess, okay. So, but I think it's awesome the way that they're all killed completely different.
I never caught that. That's cool. That's interesting. Very, very interesting, yeah.
But the one death in there that is not a clean vampire death is David's death. Because David's not killed by a stake. He's killed by whatever that...
It was a taxidermy thing,
taxidermy thing, right? It's a horn.
Right.
Horns are made of bone. They're not made of wood. It's not a wooden stake. So his character doesn't spontaneously combust. His character doesn't bleed out crazily. His character doesn't turn to dust or whatever else I missed, right? So does his character actually die?
Which is what leads us into the fan theory.
The fan theory is that, he didn't actually die in that movie. It's actually said later, not said in the movie later on, but as scripts go into production hell, there was a sequel that was going to be The Lost Girls, and Kiefer Sutherland was supposed to come back and reprise the role of David.
So they were trying to keep him alive.
They were trying to keep him alive.
Interesting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I will say this about Lost Boys, especially if we're looking at the context of this podcast and the order I'm watching these films. Compared to Footloose, which my biggest criticism of Footloose was that Laurie Singer looked 40 when she was playing 18. everybody in this film feels age appropriate, especially the younger kids, right? Corey Haim looks like he's 14 years old because he was when they were filming it. And Kiefer Sutherland's character is supposed to be, you would think, early 20s, right? And that's about how old he was. So that was a nice change from week to week as far as I'm concerned with the casting, I believe, was not only does it have a lot of actors in it who went on to do more things and iconic roles, but they were age appropriate for the characters.
Exactly. They were age appropriate for the characters they were supposed to play. They all did a really good job. They looked the part. I mean, this movie, like if you think of an 80s movie and like iconic 80s fashion or iconic 80s anything, if you look at this movie, it's packed with 80s nostalgia. Like if you're looking for an 80s nostalgia, this is it. And we get probably we always talk on the podcast, and you always ask people about meme-worthy type of things. The sweaty sax man scene, that is meme-worthy to like. It is talked about to this day, so much so that every year this guy, Tim Capello, he was a saxophone player. He's a very talented musician. He played for Tina Turner on like multiple tours and stuff like that. Every year he goes back to Santa Cruz during their summer nights where they show movies, and they show this movie, and he plays that song every year. Has done it for like 20 years, gone out there and done it, the Sweaty Sax Man. Like, I mean, and it's a catchy tune too. Like, I watched it yesterday again, and I was like, man, this is a bop. This is pretty good. And I don't use the word bop very often, but that was pretty good.
Let's talk about the meme-worthy stuff while we're on the subject. We'll come back to the sands of time. But you said inviting a vampire makes you powerless?
Yeah.
Explain what you mean by that. I'm trying to remember.
Not necessarily that's so much meme-worthy, but like that's the first time I've heard that. And I watched this movie multiple times, and I probably missed it, but now I'm watching it in a little bit different analytical aspect. Like, inviting a vampire into your home makes you powerless. Like, that's the rule. Like, Edward Herrmann character, his Max, says that in this movie, and it makes you powerless. I'm like,
that's right. Now I remember.
That busts everything. Like, I know if you invite one into your house, like they can't come in. Like, there's some sort of magic spell. Like, they can't come into your house unless you invite them in. But inviting a vampire makes you powerless. Like, that trope just in general ruins like every other vampire movie if that's true.
And you've got another note on here. It says the appearance of vamping out not done again until Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Now, are you referring to the film or the series?
The series.
Okay, what do you mean by vamping out?
So vamping out, well, so the term vamping out is said by Corey Feldman. And then the whole...
I'm going to play dumb here because I don't... Referring to the style?
So the style of vampire, right?
Okay.
Prior to this movie, right, we have very iconic Dracula-type characters that are vampires,
Wear
right?
the cape with the big collar.
Exactly. Or even if you, like, Jim Carrey was in a vampire movie, and...
Go ahead. Finish your thought.
He was in a vampire movie, but he was just a regular vampire with long teeth. He didn't, like, get all swollen, and his brow didn't get enlarged.
I was going to get back to that. That was an Easter egg. I don't know if you caught it, but I did in Lost Boys.
Yeah.
In the video store, Once Bitten was also a Warner film, and the poster for that, or like a giant cardboard cutout, is in the video
being shown
store
in the background.
And I pointed that out. I said, I see an Easter egg. I don't know if it was meant.
There are a lot of Easter eggs. So there's a Goonies poster that shows up in the video store. Obviously a nod to Richard Donner and Corey Feldman. And then there's a Rob Lowe picture, which I thought was a very weirdly placed Rob Lowe poster in Sam's bedroom on his door. And I'm thinking to myself, if I was growing up in the 80s, I would not have a picture of Rob Lowe hanging on my door.
No, you'd have the Farrah Fawcett poster.
Exactly, right? But, or something from the Dukes of Hazzards or something.
Yeah,
like
Daisy
that.
Duke.
Yeah,
there
Daisy
we go.
Duke. But, like, Rob Lowe hanging over. But that's a nod to St. Elmo's Fire, which was, directed by Schumacher like the year before.
Okay.
So there's a lot of those little Easter eggs.
And I saw a poster for Echo and the Bunnymen.
Yeah.
And they're on the soundtrack.
Yeah. They do the People Are Strange, kind of the Doors what you would call a cover
Yeah,
of it, right? But vamping out, this is the first time that a vampire vamps out, right? Where they get the swollen brow and the swollen cheekbones and the teeth and the much, meaner look. Like the first time we see this. And Josh Whedon, who went on to write and direct a lot of the Buffy the Vampire Slayer TV series with Sarah Michelle Gellar and David Boreanaz and the sexiest vampires alive. That's the first time we see that. And then, so he took that, he credits Josh Whedon, this movie, with the stylings for how he did his vampires in that TV show. So that was a pretty cool nod.
That's one of my wife's favorite shows, and she's trying to get me into watching it.
Too.
And I've seen a piece of it or two, but
let's see. How long ago? It's been 5, 6, 7, about 7 years ago. I think we watched it from start to finish.
Yeah.
And then during COVID, we watched Angel from start to finish.
When I was in college at Middle Tennessee, I took a class called pop culture class because I had an English minor and I didn't care anything about it, but I had to have it to graduate. So I took what I thought were the easiest classes to get that English credit.
Yeah.
So I took like children's literature and adolescent literature and pop culture. But my pop culture professor, he passed away a couple years ago. His name was David Lavery, and he was like the world's authority on the Buffy the Vampire Slayer television show. He had written like a college-level book and a college-level course just about that show, and he was at all the Comic-Cons and Buffy conventions. Like, everybody saw him as like the authority on that show.
All right, so that show came out 98.
It was
99,
the WB, the early days of the WB.
The tail end of the 90s.
Yeah.
And about the same time as like Dawson's Creek and Seventh Heaven. Like, I think they were all on a block together as far as the TV shows went. But I remember watching like the first few seasons of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and to my going, it was so witty the way the show was written and the type of dialogue that the characters had, and like the Xander character and the Willow character, like they were so witty and so smart. And I was still in high school at the time, and I'm thinking to myself, man, I wish my high school was as cool as, like, I wish I had friends like as cool as these people.
You wanted to be in Sunnyvale?
I wanted to be in Sunnyvale. Like, you could transport me with the exception of being bit by a vampire, I'd go to Sunnyvale. I've
seen enough of that show to know the characters and everything, but I haven't really gotten into it. Yeah. But yeah, my wife is super.
That's another one you need to watch. If your wife needs you to watch something like that. Well,
she said she just told me the other day she watched the movie with Christy Swanson and Jason Priestley. It was Jason Priestley, right?
Yep,
from like 1992. No, Luke Perry. The other guy from 90210. Yeah. She just recently watched it, and she said,
Paul Rubens.
She said it was so cheesy.
Paul Rubens is, and he has like the most iconic vampire death scene ever.
And apparently, I think I know what you're talking about. But apparently, that the movie is in canon with the show as well. That they're not separate things. And Audrey has explained it to me in depth.
Well, yeah, there's like this whole like Watchers, and there's different Buffys and different iterations of them and stuff. Yeah.
All right. Should this movie be remade?
No, I don't think it should be remade.
Has it aged well? Again, the question, if it's been in a can for 37 years now and we just found it, what would we think of it? I think it would look like an 80s movie.
Oh yeah.
It really would.
Yeah.
And there's a reason, I think, why it falls into that cult classic category for that reason, because it just looks and feels like an 80s movie. You mentioned the styles and a lot of the tropes and a lot of the various things. It just really felt 1987.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree 100% with that.
But it wasn't preachy. It didn't have anything that aged poorly as far as all that goes, because it was a campy, fun comedy horror movie. It wasn't trying to make a point.
Yeah, I don't think we were trying to, talk about political or socioeconomic.
No, there were movies in the 80s that did.
Yeah, no, there was, right? Like, there were some scenes, like when you're doing like typical 80s movies in general. We talked about this on Beverly Hills Cop too, like where they show the difference between Detroit and Beverly Hills. Well, at the very beginning of the movie, they're showing what Santa Carla?
Santa Clara.
Santa Carla. I'm going to get it right before the end of the podcast. They're showing like the blight of that town, right? And what, all these murders have done. And this is truly like the town is truly based on a real thing. Like Santa Cruz, California in the 1970s, towards the end of the 70s, there was like a murder spree that went on through there for 30 plus years. And originally they were going to use Santa Cruz, California. And the city of Santa Cruz said, nope, we don't want to be associated with that period of past. You need to change the name.
When the movie started, we see the boardwalk first. It's the first thing we see in the film. And my mind went East Coast because I didn't know where it took place. I'm thinking Jersey.
Like the shore or something like that.
Right. I'm thinking now Coney Island. That's what, because you see the roller coaster and the boardwalk and everything. And then you see the California Republic flag. And I was like, okay, it threw me for a loop. And then we're on the West Coast instead. Now, they did make a direct-to-DVD sequel, actually 2 of them. In 2008, called Lost Boys: The Tribe, and Corey Feldman returned for that one. Kiefer Sutherland's half-brother, Angus Sutherland, played the lead vampire named Shane. And then they made another direct-to-DVD sequel 2 years later called Lost Boys: The Thirst. Corey Feldman was the executive producer of that and also played reprised his role. And so did Newlander returned as well for that one. So we had both the Frog Brothers.
The Frog Brothers both.
And Corey Haim was attached to it and passed away before it went into filming. So he could have been in the movie, and I don't know if they had to rewrite it to write his character out, but he was attached to that.
I didn't see either one of these, and I'm not sad about it. I think normally I look at movies and I look at sequels, and I don't judge a sequel based on the original. That's normally my thought process. But I think in 2007, when there was probably buzz about The Tribe coming out, I probably might have been excited about it, but then I probably heard, oh, no, it's direct to DVD or direct to home video or whatever, and then I thought to myself, nothing direct to home video is any good, which is a completely opposite thought process,
now
14 years later,
right?
In the 2020s, that almost everything is direct to home release now. I mean, like the last time I went to a movie theater is probably 2 years ago because everything is streaming now. So to have that thought process and to think about that and go, no, I'm not going to give this movie the time of day because it was direct to home. Now, granted, I've read the reviews on them, and they both were probably very well reserved reviews that they were both pretty horrible movies, but...
Well, if you're a Lost Boys fan and you want to see more to the story, whether it's a sequel or a reboot, there was one announced in 2021, but it appears to have died in development hell.
Yeah, and I think it is reboot as more than sequel.
Right.
Like they were literally just going to reimagine the idea and redo it, like the last I heard about it. And I don't think they should. Yeah. I think this movie, like I said at the beginning, I'm going to stand by this. I think this movie has had multiple renaissances. It's gone away and it's come back, and it's been like as far as the history of it goes, you can watch it anytime you want to watch it and enjoy it. I don't think it's a story that needs to be redone. Nope. I think it should be left as is. It was a great, fantastic movie. Yes, there's a few things in it that, for me, dialogue-wise, now that I, think is kind of silly, but I can look past it because it's a fun movie.
And it's not. We mentioned this at the beginning. It's being a cult classic, or maybe this was off air when you and I were talking. It's not one of those movies you immediately think of when you think of 80s movies. And so I think if you remade it today, almost 40 years later, to an entirely new generation, they wouldn't even remember the original one.
Certainly not on my radar. Like when I think of 80s movies, right? Like I go to Back to the Future, or I go to anything by John Hughes. Like that to me, 16 Candles, Pretty in Pink, like those are the movies I go to. This, like when I think of horror movies, this is one that I would go to, but not necessarily think of it as an 80s movie. Yeah.
It's not one that if I looked at the poster, I wouldn't have thought it was an 80s movie. And I even mentioned that when it was on, I said, I would have thought this was like 1992. It felt a little bit even ahead of its time, maybe by a few years. It didn't really feel, well, I'm contradicting myself now because I did say it felt like an 80s movie, but it does feel like a late 80s movie. It feels like one of those movies that would have been out in that time period at the same time as a Bill and Ted, and it kind of was. So it definitely has a different feel than all these other movies. Almost every movie I've done on this podcast has been from 1984. It was such a rich year in film. That this one, you can sense the shift in filmmaking in just those 3 or 4 years between the time Beverly Hills Cop and The Terminator were made into this.
Well, yeah, I mean, 1987 just alone, like there were a lot of blockbusters in 87. There were a lot of really good movies that came out.
And 87 was probably the year that the VHS tape finally took hold, as every house has a VCR.
Were we in the Betamax VHS wars at that point?
No, we were past. VHS had won.
Yeah, we were past Betamax.
VHS had won and had established itself as the dominant format. But I'm like, that's when the technology started getting cheap enough that everybody had.
And video stores started popping up everywhere.
Which I think is why a video store is the central piece of this movie, because it was, at the time, the cultural zeitgeist, right? It's where you went.
Video store / comic book stores. Yeah.
The top 10 movies of 1987 was Witches of Eastwick was 10, Lethal Weapon, and then Stakeout, The Secret of My Success, The Untouchables. Moonstruck was 5, Good Morning Vietnam. 3rd was Beverly Hills Cop 2. 2nd, Fatal Attraction. And then, weirdly, the biggest movie of 1987 was 3 Men and a Baby.
Wow, that's not the list that I saw. I saw a different list.
That's the highest grossing that's in North America.
Okay.
That's North American gross according to the Wikipedia article.
Ted Danson, Steve Guttenberg, Tom Selleck flick, right?
And maybe a ghost hiding by the window.
Oh, I think I went domestic box office for 87 grossing movies is what I looked at.
Oh, okay.
Beverly Hills Cop 2, Platoon, Fatal Attraction, The Untouchables.
Platoon's not even on my list here.
Baby. Yeah, Platoon, 136. Maybe this is all time, though, too. Yeah. Wow. Maybe it's adjusted for... It says calendar
Platoon
grosses.
was released in 86. That's why.
Oh, okay.
So it made its money in 87.
Gotcha. La Bamba's on there, too. Yeah, Richie Valens.
Well, that's going to wrap up Lost Boys. I think we've covered it. We've talked about the film. We've talked about the cast. Has my mind been changed on the film? Probably not, because I liked it. I really liked it. You didn't have to convince me it was good, but it definitely is of its time, and it is what it is.
Is it too bold of me to ask for you to take me out with Sweaty Sax Man when we're leaving this podcast for the end?
Sure.
You just seem so grossed out by that, but it is awesome.
Maybe so. All right, we'll play a little bit of it. There we go. I don't want to get flagged. I don't want to get my podcast taken down for copyright violation. Thanks for coming in on short notice. I know you did have to take time out of your day to be here. I appreciate it.
I am happy to be here.
Well, thank you, Michael. And let's do it again. And you can be one of my regulars because you've seen all these movies and I haven't, and it's really fun talking about them with you. And Monster Squad. Monster Squad. I want to say Monster
1987's The Monster Squad.
Okay, 2 weeks after this movie, and there's a reason I haven't heard of it, so we might have to watch that one around Halloween. Thanks again, man.
All right, we'll see you.
Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Video Oblivious. And stick around, another new episode with a different movie is just a few days away. Thanks to my guests for being a part of the show. And if you'd like to be a part of the show, send me an email, zbennett@gmail.com. That's zbennett@gmail.com. Maybe there's a movie you love that I've never seen. Send me an email, we'll connect, and we might even talk about it here on the podcast. And don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, whatever your platform allows. Give us a good rating if you really enjoyed this podcast. And thanks again for listening to Video Oblivious.